Hitler thought of and directed the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a mass extermination of Jews from the period of 1933 to 1945. The word Holocaust means all consumed by fire. Hitler was a leader in the Nazi Socialist Party. The Socialists hated Jews, gypsies, disabled, and elderly people. Jews were doctors, business people, lawyers, bankers, teachers, etc., and they were still blamed for all of Germany's economic problems. The truth was Germany lost badly in World War I, and they had to pay off their debt to France, so they didn't have as much money left. Hitler passed laws that made Jews give up their homes, their jobs, their businesses, and their rights. To enforce these laws, police organizations known as the Gestapo and the SS imprisoned, beaten, even murdered Jews for no reason at all. Many Jews and other enemies of the Nazis were put in prisons called concentration camps. Hitler wanted to protect German blood and German honor for the white non-Jews known as Aryans. Then, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, which made Britain and France, who were allies of Poland, declare war on Germany, which started World War II. Soon, Germany conquered most of Europe. Secretly fighting the Nazis were secret groups of partisans or resistance. They sabotaged the German army and rescued Jews. Soon Hitler decided to build death camps. At the death camps, they gassed, shot, and burned Jews. After they were dead, they put them in a crematorium, which is a huge fireplace, and then they burned them. German people all over Germany bought pillows stuffed with dead Jewish hair and lampshades that were made of dead Jews' skin. It was all part of Hitler's final solution to rid Europe of all Jews. Out of 9 million Jews that once lived in Europe before the Holocaust, only 3 million survived. That means 6 million got killed or by the Nazis. That many people is about as many people from San Jose all the way up to Benicia, all the way from the Bay Area. That's as many people. Here we are interviewing Elaine Unger, who's going to tell us what it was like for Jews in America.
Jews in America at that time had some idea of the atrocities in Germany because some German Jews escaped and were accepted into American society. But there were Americans who did not want the Jewish people here, and so their numbers of them that came were limited to very, very few. But Jewish Americans were in favor of the war, in favor of helping to defeat Hitler and his forces, and many of them joined the services. My husband, Charles Unger, enlisted in 1943 to the Army Air Force. In those days, it was called the Army Air Corps because the force did not have its own department. And he went in as a cadet, and after 9 months of schooling as a meteorologist and weather forecaster, he was a second lieutenant, and he was assigned to the 441st Troop Carrier Command, and their function was to bring supplies into the army in Europe and bring the wounded out to London. He was in Europe for 4 years. After the war, he was with the Army of Occupation and was stationed in Germany and had several German meteorologists working for him. And he found no antagonism to him, but he did not socialize much with the Germans at that particular time. When he was in the United States, he was at several different airfields and officer training schools before he was sent overseas, 1944. So he was there for D-Day at Omaha Beach, and after the war, he was hospitalized in London for a broken wrist that had healed the wrong way. And after that, after they fixed his wrist, he was sent to Germany and came home in 1947.
So what's that atlas you have there?
This atlas shows the various places he was while he was training. He was in Missouri, in Sedalia, with the 441st Troop Carrier Command, and at the weather station in Kansas City. And his schooling, we have to find the northern part, was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which he has encircled. We're gonna have.
Did people treat you differently during the war and after it?
No. No. A lot of Americans who stayed at home did various types of volunteer work. I worked at what's called a USO, United Service Organization, that had places for soldiers, sailors, airmen on their time off or in between trips to come and get a meal and socialize with some people. I also volunteered and sold what they called war bonds in those days to raise money for the war effort. My mother helped the Red Cross by packaging bandages and other supplies that were needed in Europe. And the American Jews did what they could to help the effort and to help bring people back to the United States. When Charles Unger first was sent over to Europe with the 441st Troop Carrier Command, he was sent to England, and he was in various places in England before he went overseas to France. He was in London, Nottingham, Cornwall, and various other places before he was sent to France. Mm-hmm. He left from England and was in Japan and Lacan and other places before the assault known as D-Day occurred at Omaha Beach, and he was one of the forecasters for that enterprise. After the war, he was sent to Germany, And he was at Frankfurt and other smaller stations along the Rhine in Germany, and didn't get back to the United States until 1947. So he was in Europe for 4 years. This
Okay.
one, when he was in Germany,
Hold it up.
and this one was when he was training with the 441st in Sedalia. And this is at the Officers Club in Germany, 1945. And this was when he was in school at Grand Rapids. And that's, pictures are quite different 61 years ago.
Thank you, Mrs. Ungar, for answering my questions and coming to
I was happy to do it, and if you have any more questions, feel free to call me.
thank you. Kristallnacht was a night where Nazis broke into Jewish people's homes and shops. It happened the night of November 9th and 10th. It caused lots of damage to Jewish homes and shops. Here I am interviewing Mr. Heyman, who survived the Holocaust when he was a young boy.
Very young.
Okay, so where were you when in the Holocaust? Like,
Well, I was actually in 2 camps because we were living in Holland at the time. And we were living in a little town called Doorn, and we were picked up in 1942. And first we were sent to a Dutch camp called Westerbork, which is kind of in the northeast corner of Holland. And from there, and there we were maybe, not exactly sure, but maybe a year, maybe 14 months. And then we were shipped to Bergen-Belsen, and we stayed there for another year and a half till the war ended and we were liberated. And all totaled in the 2 camps, we were there about 3 years, from 1942 to 1945.
wow. How'd you get caught? Do you remember?
Well, you know, no one really knows, because you just, all of a sudden, the Germans show up and they knock on your door and they say, you know, pack a suitcase, you're out of here. So it's not like a democratic system like they say, you know, your neighbor John Smith said that you were Jewish and so we're picking you up. So you never really knew who turned you into the authorities, but there were lots of informers in those days. And so somebody turned us in. But I think also you had to register, so, you know, and if you didn't register, there were great penalties, and, you know, you had to wear a Jewish star and all kinds of stuff. So it was very dangerous to hide and all that. And so it was just a matter of sooner or later they were going to find you. Unless you went underground, which means that a Dutch family, in this case because we were in Holland, would hide you. But that was extremely dangerous because, like, if you were caught, you were just shot on the spot. There was no trial, no nothing. So some people did that, but most people did not do that.
So what was it like in the concentration camps?
Well, you know, because I was so young, I can't really tell you a lot about that because I don't really remember. Okay? But I can tell you that the one we were in, like, children were with their mothers and fathers were in a different part of the camp, and they had to work. Women had to work also, but men had more strenuous type jobs. You know, it was really primitive and I'm sure very boring with nothing really to do. And, you know, from reading your books, you know that there was never enough to eat and no medical service whatsoever, and everything was pretty bad.
Yeah.
From my mom, I've been told that the worst part was probably that the Germans made a roll call. You know, they had like everybody get out of bed 6 o'clock in the morning and stand in the long line, and you had to be counted so that they made sure that there was like nobody missing.
Yeah.
And that doesn't sound like a real bad deal, but it's really cold in the winter, and you didn't have, you know, a nice parka to grab, and so you were sick, and so the roll calls, and they could last a long time, because if they miscounted, or if there was somebody gone, or if there was somebody back in the barracks that they forgot about, they'd just count all over again. So these roll calls could take an hour, 2 hours, or longer. I'm not really sure. But that was one of the really hard things.
Wow. That's hard.
That was hard.
Do you remember what it was like on the day you got liberated?
Well, I think I do, but my mom and I have a little disagreement, so I'm not sure if I'm totally correct. But see, what happened at the end of the war was that the Germans knew that the Americans were coming from the west. And so what happened was they made us all walk like an hour to the train station, and they put us on a train, and they shipped us. We were going east. Like the map you showed me, you know, there were a lot of concentration camps in Poland. So they wanted to get us away from the Americans. So we were on this train, just like you see in the movies, going east. And one day, the train stopped during the night, and what happened was that the train literally ran into the Russian army, because the Russians were coming from the east and the Americans were coming from the west. So the train stopped, and the conductor, the engineer who was driving the train jumped off and whatever. So my recollection is that I looked outside, and there was a Russian sentry, you know, a Russian soldier with a rifle on his shoulder, walking up and down the train. And that's kind of how we got liberated. And it was outside of a little town. And my recollection is that all the kids ran into the town, and because a lot of the Germans were out of the town because they wanted to get away from the Russians also, so there were a lot of vacant houses. And my recollection is that we carried back a lot of food to the train because there were a lot of sick people and hungry people and all that. And so that's kind of how we got liberated. We ran into the Russian army. Well, it was a good thing, because if we hadn't, it would have been a bad thing, because I'm sure they didn't have good ideas for us.
Yeah, they probably didn't, because as they say, going to the east was
But it's not a good thing.
Austerlitz.
Exactly. Or one of those places.
Yeah, one of the death camps. Wow, you're lucky that you got on, that a Russian guy helped.
That's right. I
liberate
was very
the
lucky.
train. Yeah.
But then also, I'll tell you that, you know, people going through this experience got really sick because there was no drugstore to get pills, and so either you got lucky and you got well, or you got unlucky and you died. So that was the bad part of life. And so by the time the train stopped, there were many, many people that were really sick, including me, and everybody kind of had one thing or another, but most common was people had tuberculosis.
Yeah.
And so the Russians put us in a hospital, and I don't know, I was maybe 2 or 3 weeks in the hospital. I can't really remember. But then they put us into another town, and, you know. But then there were other problems also, because the Russians were around, and the Russians were, well, I don't know, they were crazy. They drank a lot and they partied a lot, and they ran after the women a lot, and so there were all different other kinds of problems. You know, we got rid of the Germans, but now we got the Russians to deal with. But you know, knock on wood, luckily all went well, and my mom somehow got a postcard to some people that she knew in the Dutch town, which was called Doorn, and these two men came in a pickup truck, and they got us out of the town where the Russians were kind of holding us, because after the war, you had to have like a sponsor. Somebody
Yeah.
had to like vouch for you.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you would have all these people running around with no food and no clothes and no identity papers and all that. So the Russians wouldn't release you unless somebody would come and vouch for you.
Yeah.
So we were lucky. My mom got this postcard out, and somebody came and vouched for us, and so we went back to Doorn, where this whole thing started.
Wow. It's still good that the Russians, like, didn't kill you like the Germans did. Didn't
Right.
starve you. Didn't shoot you with rifles and everything like that.
That's right. That's right.
So how'd you get to America afterwards?
Well, we came to America in May of 1947, and we came to America because, well, first of all, my mom and I were the only ones that survived. So my dad died, and my 4 grandparents died, and my uncle all died in the concentration camp. So at the end, my dad survived till we got liberated, but he died in the hospital when the Russians had us. And I asked my mom if she thought that my dad knew that we were liberated, and she said she really wasn't sure, because he was so sick that he slept most of the time, and he just passed away very quickly. So my mom and I were the only ones left. So my mom had a sister who was married and had a daughter who lived in Philadelphia. And because being in Europe had such bad memories for my mom, she just wanted to leave. She just wanted to get away from Holland, from Germany, from everything. And so this was really her only option, was to come to America. She also had some relatives in Santiago, Chile, but that was further away, and those relatives were more distant, so she chose to come to America. Plus, it's always people's dream to go to America because, you know, there's a bright future and you can make money and all that stuff. So we came to America in 1947 and stayed with my mom's sister for a couple of months, and then we came to California because some of my mom's parents' friends lived in Berkeley, and my mom was very close to these people because these friends would come over a lot while she was growing up, and they left before the whole Holocaust started, so they lived in Berkeley, and there was maybe 6 or 8 of these people, and so we decided to come out west.
Wow.
And we've been in the Bay Area ever since 1947.
Wow, that's a long time.
That is a long time, believe me.
Yeah, it's so sad that your dad died in the hospital because, I mean, there were people that got liberated and then they were starved and they ate so much food and their stomachs couldn't hold it. And
That's right.
there are people that died of sickness like your dad and so many other reasons that they couldn't live even after liberation. And the other thing that's sad is some people died, like, you know, they died during the night of liberation, and if they just hung on a little bit more, they would have been able to get some food and medicine. They might have been able to, and once they got that, then they would hold them off for a little bit more educated food and medicine, so they could, and then they might gradually get better, but, you know, I guess not. It's hard to think about it.
No, that's absolutely right. And I've heard from my mom exactly what you said, that when we were liberated and there was all this food available, people, you know, you would eat it, but you couldn't keep it in your stomach because your body wasn't used to all the food.
Yeah.
And it took a while till you were able to eat much of anything, even though the food was there, because your body kind of shuts down a little bit if there's nothing to eat, right? So yeah, that's quite true.
Yeah. You should gradually, like, work toward a bigger meal, like once you get there, you can eat as much, and then keep adding a little bit on, and then you'll have a bigger meal.
Yeah,
Sometime.
the whole thing about food has always been kind of a thing I think about once in a while, because like if you were to see my mom, she's slender like your mom, and I've always been slender, and I think in that way we were very lucky because we didn't need as much food as opposed to somebody that's, a big person or fat person or whatever, and I think we were able to survive on less because we were thin, and it's just our body type. It's not
Yeah.
because we're any better than anybody
Yeah.
else. It's just, you're born with certain genes and all that. So I attribute part of my luck of being here because I have thin genes, if you will, and it doesn't take as much. And even now, I'm not a real big eater. I've never really been a big eater in my life.
Yeah.
But I'm very healthy, but I'm not a real big
Yeah.
eater.
So, sometimes it feels like, you want to eat stuff, and then you gotta eat stuff, and sometimes you're just like, oh, I don't want to eat anything, even though I haven't eaten anything for a long time.
Right. So I notice in your books that you have, the one about Anne Frank. When Judy and I were in Holland, we went to Anne Frank's house, and that was really interesting. And hopefully you'll be able to go to Europe one day and go to Amsterdam and see that.
Yeah.
I think you'd really enjoy that. They have a tour that goes all through it,
Yeah.
and it's amazing. And she was in Bergen-Belsen, by the way.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to tell you was you have this book on the resistance.
Yeah.
And, a lot of the people in the countries around Germany, like in Holland and in France and in the Scandinavian countries, were not particularly good people, and they turned most, if not all, of the Jews in. But by the same token, there were lots of really, really courageous people who did incredible things as far as hiding Jewish people, helping Jewish people, helping them escape if they could, fighting in the resistance like you're going to read about. So there were lots of unbelievably good people in those countries too.
There are lots of people that helped people hide in their attics and basements.
Right. At tremendous risk.
Yeah.
At unbelievable risk.
Because if they got caught, then they would be like the Jews. They'd just get shot. They wouldn't even care.
Right. But not just them. It'd be like their kids and their grandparents. They were just gone.
Like
right.
the whole family. Everyone
so,
was connected to them.
So if you think about it, it's just, to me, almost unbelievable that there are people who would take those kinds of risks.
Yeah.
And there were quite a few.
Some people, they did it only because they got paid a lot of money. And then even after they did it, they held them for a month. And then they decided, they don't want to, and they kept their money, and then they threw the Jews out. Like
that happened too.
So it's
that happened too.
Like even though that they got paid a lot of money, they still wouldn't hold them, even though they promised to do it.
Right. When we came over here, my mom remarried, and my stepdad, who was over there also, he was hidden on a farm during the war, and he ended up not going to a concentration camp.
Wow.
So he was very lucky.
Yeah. Yeah. People like you're very lucky because only a third of the Jews in Europe survived.
Is that right?
Yeah. There were 9 million first, and then 6 million got killed or got armchair murdered.
Right.
Which is, they just let you starve.
Right.
Or they just let you get sick, like you said. People just got sick and starved.
Right.
Even though they don't shoot them, kind of.
Right.
Uh-huh.
So, let me see, what else can I tell you? Well, I'll tell you one other thing. I'll tell you a couple other things. But my mom lived in Mannheim. She was born in Heidelberg, which is very close to Mannheim, like half hour by car. And my mom had a cousin that lived a couple of blocks away, and their name was Rice, R-E-I-S-S. And my mom's cousin's name was Peter. And Peter Rice and his mom and dad and his wife also were in the concentration camp with us in Bergen-Belsen. And the grandparents, his mother survived, he survived, the daughter survived. I think only his father died in the concentration camp. But after the war, Peter Rice's mom wrote a very small, it's not even a book, manuscript that I'm going to give you. I copied it for you yesterday. And it's going to tell you in much greater detail and more specifically how life was in Bergen-Belsen, much better than I could. And it's about 60 pages, and it's, you know, it's not book size, but I think you'll really enjoy it.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I want to tell you, though, when you read it, and that is that the Rice family was a little luckier than we were because Peter Rice worked in the kitchen. And so he was able to smuggle out a little food, even though that was very dangerous.
Yeah.
But they had more than most people did, so I think maybe that's why more of them survived. So when you read it, it was probably even a little worse than they describe it because they had it a little better. And by the same token, we were a little luckier also than most of the other people in the camp because the Germans had a little system going where they would hold some of the prisoners for ransom.
Yeah.
And if someone, didn't matter if it was a relative or a friend, would send the Germans money, then they gave you certain privileges.
Yeah.
And somebody sent the Germans money for us, and to this day we don't know who that was. Nobody has stepped forward and nobody has told us. But it gave us certain privileges. For instance, we have no tattoo on our arm, right? Because all the other prisoners usually had a tattoo in their arm. We didn't have our heads shaved, which for my mom was a huge thing. And we got to keep our own clothes. So we didn't have to wear the striped clothes that most of the other people had to wear. And maybe best of all, we didn't get any extra food, but once in a while, because my mom had a small child, we got excused from these horrible lineups in the morning in the cold in the winter. I don't know how often, and I don't think it was once a week, but once in a while, we got an excuse and we didn't have to stand in these lineups.
Wow.
So, you know, it probably doesn't sound like a real big thing now that we're here and we're okay, but I think at the time it was
Huge.
you know, a huge plus that we had that a lot of the other people didn't have.
And there was also an area of Bergen-Belsen that, like, people that had lots of connections to America also had more rights, kind of like you know. They got excused and they didn't get mistreated as much, and they got to wear their own clothes. And there was just, I read a book. It was a book about the Holocaust. I don't remember exactly which one, but there was a Jewish tourist. He got caught and he got shipped off, and it's amazing because he was an American tourist that was touring Germany in like 1935 or something like that, and he got shipped off, and he had no idea that was going on. He just wanted to tour Germany. And
bad luck, huh?
yeah, bad luck.
Wow. Okay.
Very bad luck for him. Here's some pictures of my grandpa that you might want to see.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to.
He was in the Air Corps. He was a weatherman. He worked on the D-Day project.
Wow. Now which one is he? There's 3 men in here.
Man, he didn't even tell me, but I think.
That's okay. Let's look at the other pictures.
I think in that one he's that one on the left.
Oh, handsome.
And
Oh, look at that.
there's him. And there's.
Okay, that's pretty snappy.
Yeah, he was.
That's a great picture.
Yeah.
is a little dark, huh?
Yeah, but you can see his face. And then, I guess that's the same picture. I guess there's 2 copies of that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. Well, that's great that you have these.
Yeah.
So these have to be 1945.
Yep.
So let's see, 50, that's 60 years. Goodness gracious. It's almost as old as I am. That is really old. So what else are you interested in? What else can I tell you that, see, I wish I could tell you more about the camp, but I can't because I was like 4 years old.
4 years old.
You know?
You were
You have to
little,
sit back
it's
a
hard to
little.
remember.
And so, you know, I have a bad memory anyway. And so at 4 and 5, I really don't, but one of the things that you'll see my name mentioned in this little manuscript that I'm going to give you. And one of the things that this lady says about me is that I was always running around having a good time. And you know, kids are kind of oblivious to what they're going through, especially when they're 3 and 4 and 5. And I think even when I was that old, I was a happy person and a positive person, and I just, you know, to a great degree I still am. So I think, you know, that kind of helped also to kind of get me through, and that I could entertain myself. And, you know, kids find the dumbest things to play with, even in horrible situations. So I don't really remember, I don't remember anything about the food or lack thereof. I remember once in a while there'd be dog fights above the camp, which was like really exciting because nothing ever happened.
Yeah, you're just sitting there all day.
Yeah, you know, you're playing in the dirt with nothing. I can't remember anything that I had or owned, like a car or a toy. I can't remember anything like that. I don't know. I don't. There's other theories that says that a lot of times people suppress really bad experiences. You know, like wipe it out of your mind. So I don't know if I A, have a bad memory, or B, have suppressed those remembrances because they were so bad. But I really don't. I remember on the train, our train ride. Well, again, I don't really remember very much about it because I was so little, but I do remember that there was a lot of confusion, and there were a lot of the people were sick, and so they were transported by truck to the train station. And again, I don't remember much about the train ride itself, except that there was very little to eat, and the Germans kept saying, oh, you know, tonight the train's going to stop and there's going to be a food and all that. And most days the train would just keep going and there was no food. And once in a while there would be some food in the forms of potatoes and like no meat, maybe a little vegetable, and somehow the train would stop and then people would get out and they had a pot and they'd build a fire and they would try to heat these things and make like a little soup out of it. I have no idea where all those pots came from, but that's kind of how it was. And my only recollection from the train ride itself was that we would go through a lot of towns, and the Germans were trying to get out also, and so there'd be these people milling about on the train station as we're going through, and the kids, being kids, would wave at the train, not knowing who was on the train or anything like that. And that's really the only memory I have. And then when we were liberated, I think we already talked about that. But one thing I did want to tell you, kind of sneak in here, was, you know, a lot of people got out of Germany early, meaning before the Nazis clamped down, and it was kind of a strange thing, because in the beginning there was no problems, but it's like every year or every 6 months the Germans would come up with new regulations which would make it harder and harder to leave. like in the beginning, you could just leave and take all your money, and then you could only take, you know, so much money, and then you could take less money, and, you know, so in the end, it was almost impossible to leave. But we had purchased tickets to go to Santiago, Chile, where some of our family already was. But in the final analysis, my mom didn't want to leave the 4 grandparents because they didn't want to leave and start life all over again. So they made this horrible decision to stay, and that's how that was, because if we'd have left on the boat when we could have, and we had the tickets, you know, everybody would have been fine and we would have made it. But as fate had it,
Yeah.
it didn't work that way because my mom didn't want to leave her parents and
Yeah.
all of that.
But I understand that because you wouldn't want to leave your parents, like
Right.
if you're traveling all the way across an ocean
Right.
to a place that you haven't really ever been before. Even if you have some distant relatives there, you might still, you know, not know what it's like there, and you still might not want to go necessarily.
Right.
So,
So what else would you like to talk about?
well, what was your family like before the war? Like, and
Well, what was my family like before the war? We actually had a fairly small family. My mom was born in Heidelberg and moved to Mannheim. My father was born in Mannheim. My father's family was in the grain business. And I have a picture here, I don't know if your camera will pick it up, of their factory.
Maybe
Uh,
stand up with it and bring it closer because of
I can
reflection
do that.
here.
I can do
And,
that.
okay, and then hold it maybe right about, I'm gonna just move the camera.
See that?
Yeah.
So it was this big grain mill where they converted grain to flour, and you know they have all these railroad sidings and all that.
wow, that's
And at the top of the thing used to be our name, Heyman, but I don't know what happened to it. I don't even know if it survived the war, to tell you the truth. So that was my grandfather's business, and on my mother's side, they were partners in a company that made catalogs. You know, you get all these catalogs in the mail and all that. Right, and so they were in the catalog business, and my grandfather was a partner in this business, and he also did a lot of traveling to promote the business and stuff like that. So my mom had one sister who ended up moving to Philadelphia before the war with her husband, and she has one child, my cousin, and my dad had one brother, a younger brother, and he perished in the war in a concentration camp. We don't know what happened to him. And that's pretty much our family. We have a small family.
Yeah. Small, nice family that kind of got taken over. You had a huge business, and one
Right.
day it's yours, next day it's ours.
Right. Yeah, it was like, you know, one day you own it and the next day you don't. I tell you though, what did happen was that after the war, the German government made restitutions, meaning that they paid for a variety of things. For instance, they paid for the factory, but they paid like less than a penny on the dollar, and it's like their value, not the real value. You know, it's hard to value a business like that. So we got little bits of money for a variety of things, like for the loss of my dad and his earning power, you know, they paid something. The loss of the grandparents, I have no idea what it was, but it was a lot less. I mean, it wasn't like $1 million. It was more like $15,000 or, you know, something in that range.
Yeah, I mean, like, it was probably worth about $1 million, but they didn't give it
You
to
know what? I have no idea. I have no idea how profitable it was, how many people worked there. I should ask my mom, but she just doesn't like to talk about some of these things.
Yeah.
And brings back a lot of memories for her. So I've learned a lot from her, but there's a lot that I probably don't know and should have asked her.
Yeah.
when my mom was growing up in Mannheim in their house, they had like a sitting room. Well, I guess like a parlor or like a little extra room with a fireplace. And one of the things that survived was kind of a corner picture of this fireplace area, and on two walls you can see some of the art that the family had. And they had some, in those days already expensive art, but some French Impressionist paintings, like they had a Van Gogh and a Pizarro, and I don't know what else they had. They had 3 or 4 that are in that picture. But all through these years, so for the last 55 years, my mom always will go to a museum, or if it's like an art sale or an auction is in the paper, she'll always see if she can find this Van Gogh, and it's never turned up. I don't know, it's probably still hanging in somebody's house in Holland, but they had some beautiful paintings. And actually, the story goes a little further. I'm just remembering that my son, my youngest son Jeff, at one point was trying to find out more about these paintings, and through hook and crook he got in contact with a man in London, I believe, who is kind of a detective in lost art. And this man was, we sent him the picture, the photograph of the art, and he started looking around, and he never came up with anything. But there was also, at the same time, 60 Minutes was doing a program on the subject of art that was lost and never recovered. And for a while there, we thought that maybe they would take up our story and that we would get more exposure and all of that. But in order to do, and it never got that far. 60 Minutes never contacted us. But had they contacted us, my mom would have had to been interviewed, and she's a very private person, and I can guarantee you she would, I don't know, I think she would not have agreed to the interview, but who knows, maybe with the chance that the art could have been found, she would have done it. But we were fairly close, not real close, but somewhat close to getting on 60 Minutes with this whole story of the lost art, but it never happened. So, and the guy kind of quit looking. He looked for a while, and then he wanted some serious money to keep looking, and we decided that, you know, it just wasn't worth it. We didn't want to get involved, and what's done is done, and what's gone is gone. Luckily, you know, we're in good health and we're doing fine, so we decided not to pursue it. But that was kind of the story that I forgot to tell you about the Heyman Lost Art Gallery.
Thanks for letting me interview you, Mr. Heyman. Thanks so much. You got a lot of good information, and it will let me understand it better.
Great.
For actually talking to someone.
I'm more than happy to do that, and like I told you before, if you have any other questions, you feel free to call me. I'd be glad to talk to you some more. Okay?
Thanks so
Great.
much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay, this is Mrs. Judy Heyman, who has a piece of jewelry that helps her remember that her husband was in the Holocaust, and that it can remind her that so many people died even though she wasn't in it.
That's true. This ring that I have was given to me by my mother-in-law on one of my birthdays, and actually it was one stone in a brooch that had 3 sapphires in it, and this brooch was given to my mother-in-law to her mother by her husband. So it's an old brooch, and what I did was had it cut down and made into several pieces of jewelry that I wear, and I wear the ring all the time. It's very special to me.
So, do you think we could get that ring more
Certainly.
up close to the camera
Certainly.
so that they can...
Do you want to take it up and hold it? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oops, higher, a little higher. There you go.
Very beautiful, isn't it? Yeah, it's very, very beautiful.
Don't touch the stone. Okay, now you can go bring it back.
Thank you. What I know about the jewelry is, I don't know a lot about it, but I think this is one of the pieces that was given to Peter's stepfather's nanny, and she was able to keep it a few things safe during the war, and then afterwards my mother-in-law was able to get it back, which was very fortunate, and thank God that there were people like that would keep things safe, and they would not run with them or whatever, because I know that happened with a lot of other people. So it's very special to me.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you for letting me interview
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much. Very recently, we figured out that someone in a book that I recently read called Four Perfect Pebbles was on the same train that Peter was on when he got liberated. Okay, here we are interviewing Mrs. Newsenbaum. She was a survivor in the Holocaust, so we're gonna interview her. Okay, how did you survive the Holocaust?
Actually, my family was very fortunate. Hitler came to power in 1933, and we left Germany in 1937. We left as a family, and my father we went to Belgium, and from Belgium we went to the United States. Our life during the Holocaust years were quite different from what they were before. Before, we had a comfortable life. My father had a business with a number of Christian employees, and then after when the Nazis came to power, the business was taken away. The employees were dismissed, and he was asked to leave the country. And in school, my situation was very different. Also, before that, I'd gone to a public school, which was a very good one, and then I was to continue on to the high school, to the Lyceum. But when the Nazis came to power in 1933, Jews were not wanted. At first, we were permitted to stay in the school, in the high school, but we had to leave at certain times when the Nazi youth organization had its meetings, and they made it very plain that they didn't want Jews. They didn't want to talk to us. One girl said to me, if you're Jewish, how come you don't smell from herring? And there were all kinds of taunts like that. Also, in our daily lives, things had changed very much. We couldn't go to the movies. We couldn't go to a concert. We couldn't go to a park. People on the street accosted us because we had the yellow star. And Nazi youth made collections for what they called a one-way ticket to Palestine, because they wanted to get us out of the country. So our situation had changed very much, and we were quite content to leave when we did leave. We were fortunate enough to leave as a family. We went to Belgium first, where my father had saved some of his money, and then we went on to the United States. My husband's situation was much more complicated. He lived in Austria, where Hitler came to power very suddenly, and things were much more devastating for the Jews in the country. The men were rounded up. My husband's father had to flee. He went to Poland. The women were rounded up. They had to strip naked in the streets and clean the streets, sweep the streets. My husband was to be caught and also put into a concentration camp, but he fled to Switzerland. My husband's mother fled to England, where she became a domestic. In other words, the family dispersed, and the daughter went to Italy, where she became a governess to an Italian family. My husband came to America, where things were very difficult for him. He had no money. He had been in medical school in Austria, and he had to start all over again. He had to try to get to the University of California, but he had no money, and so he supported himself by picking tomatoes or working in a racetrack, and also working in a forge. It was a difficult time for him. when he tried to, since he had chemical background, and he tried to get a government job, he was considered an enemy alien, and therefore he couldn't get a job, except in marginal fields. And so his life was quite difficult. Eventually, though, he did earn enough money, he saved enough money to enter the University of California and studied there and got as far as a PhD and then became a professor. So this was his story. His father was not so fortunate. His father fled to Poland, where the Nazis got hold of him, and he was put into a concentration camp where he died. A cousin of mine spent his young years, his growing years, in a concentration camp where he saw his family being killed before his eyes. But he himself was saved because he was strong enough to work, and so he was saved. But he has become very bitter. Having had this awful experience, he's just never gotten over it, and his life, although he has made a successful career, his life has been very bitter, and it's something that he just cannot forget. For myself, I must say I was relatively fortunate, but of course we were old enough to understand what was going on, and it's left a deep impression on us. And we had friends whom we lost and relatives whom we lost, and we've never forgotten the awful experience of those days. And I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing so that it will not be forgotten, that people will remember it and hope that this will never happen again.
So, what was the closest call of you getting caught? Like, was there anything where the Nazis knocked on your door but you didn't answer and they went away?
No, they did. We did answer. You had to answer, otherwise they broke down your doors. But all they didn't try to, at that time they didn't want women. My father was hiding, and they didn't want women at that time in Berlin. Things moved more slowly. They came in once a week to see to it that everyone had what's called a meal cooked in one pot in order to save money for the Nazis. And if you didn't do that, they arrested you. But we had known that, and so we cooked the meal in one pot, like a casserole, and gave the extra money excuse me, that we saved, we gave to the Nazis. So I personally was stopped a few times trying to go to a movie house, and I didn't do that anymore. I didn't go to a park anymore. I didn't go to concerts anymore. My life was pretty limited. The one good thing is that there was a very strong Jewish congregation in Berlin. I lived in Berlin, in Germany, which at that time was not divided yet between East and West Germany. And we had a very strong Jewish community which established theaters and concerts and museums for the Jewish community, so that our education did not lack. We did not lack anything. We got as good an education as we would have gotten if we had stayed in the German schools. But of course it was limited to Jewish members of the community.
So what was it like in hiding for you?
Well, we were hiding at that time. We did flee to Belgium, where the Nazis had also been, and we stayed with my grandmother. We stayed in the cellar, and we were fortunate enough not to be caught. And then we got a visa to America, and we left. So we, as a family, my immediate family, we were quite fortunate, actually. As I say, my husband was not quite so fortunate.
Yeah, that's really lucky. I mean,
Yeah.
to get away.
Yes, I felt that way.
Because lots of people just got put in concentration camp.
Well, my husband's father was killed in a concentration camp. He fled to Poland, thinking that he would be safe, but then the Nazis invaded Poland.
Yeah.
And that was the thing. You fled from one country to another, and every time you thought you were safe, the Nazis conquered most of Europe, and so you were not safe, and you had to hide or you were caught. I had uncles who fled to France, and again the same thing happened. France was taken over by the Germans, and he was no longer safe then either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of people, like, from Poland, they fled to France, and then Germany invaded France, and then they weren't safe again, and then it's hard to get permits for England or Palestine
Yeah.
or the United States.
Yeah.
And then,
Well, we tried to get a permit to Palestine, but we wanted either go to Palestine or to go to the United States. States.
Yeah.
But the visa to the United States came first, and so my father decided to go to the United States. And we
Yeah.
lived in New York, and we had quite a comfortable life. But as I say, we had news or no news of my family,
Yeah.
and it's something that we will just, it's a part of my life, and it's something that I will never forget.
Yeah. So amazing, that people would do that.
Well, yes, and especially because Germany was such an educated nation. You think that people are primitive, they go about killing people, but this was extermination in a very methodical, well thought out way, and that's what made it doubly painful to think that people use their intelligence for such evil purposes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, just not nice. I never ever liked the Nazis because they just haven't been good to anybody. Well, the Nazis haven't been good to anybody unless you count blonde-haired and blue-eyed people. They like those.
Well, I I had blonde hair, I had gray eyes, but still, that didn't make any difference. If you were Jewish, then you were considered a second-class citizen or no
Yeah.
citizen at all.
Yeah, I mean, like, how can you do that? Even if they're doctors and
Oh, yes.
lawyers and
It
teachers?
didn't make any difference, no matter what your profession was.
Yeah.
My husband was in first year medical school, and they didn't permit Jews to go to school anymore. They just said one day, okay, the door's closed, you cannot come anymore.
Yeah.
And there was just nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, because I know, even though they were like some of the most important people, shop owners, it's like, even if they gave tons of money to the Nazis, they still wouldn't care. It's like it's hard to explain.
It's hard to understand how this could happen. I mean, it's
Yeah.
the greatest evil that ever happened,
Yeah.
I think. There have been, persecutions before, but usually not by educated people. These were educated people who did this, and that's, I think, is the
Yeah.
greatest horror of it all. And that's why I'm glad you're doing what you're doing, so that one
Yeah.
doesn't forget it. One shouldn't forget it, because most of the people who were involved in this are either aging, like myself, or they're already dead. And then nobody will have the story to
Yeah.
tell anymore. And this way, what you're doing keeps the memory alive.
Yeah, because otherwise people will
People
forget
forget.
about it, and then it might happen
It
again.
might happen again. Well, I hope not. I
Yeah,
really hope
I
not.
don't want it to happen again.
No, I don't think so either. I think we're fortunate to be an American. I personally, of course, am very grateful to have come to America, and I think it's a very good country, although I don't always agree with the politics. I still feel very fortunate to be
Yeah.
here, and I really think that, maybe I'm being idealistic, but I really think Americans would not have behaved like that.
Yeah.
Americans would not have been that cruel.
Yeah.
And the Germans, the interesting thing is that the Germans always, after the war, said, well, we didn't know anything. We didn't know about the camps, and we didn't do anything. We were innocent. But somebody ran those camps. Somebody took care of those camps. And somebody ran these extermination centers and the gas chambers.
Yeah.
So people did know. They were simply lying when they say that they didn't know, and they're innocent. So my generation is very much suspect. They have been guilty. Many of them
Yeah.
have been guilty. Now the younger people I feel differently about. They are no different from any other young people. They are not responsible for their parents' sins, and they, I think, have a very different attitude, and they tried very hard to make up for the sins of their fathers, and they have a very different attitude towards, a more international attitude towards people of other faiths and other religions.
Yeah. Because they don't know better if they're when Hitler used them, and Hitler told them to turn in any Jews, they're just going to do what they're told because they think, oh, that's the right thing because...
Well, also, Hitler they made it attractive for them. They gave them beautiful uniforms, and they marched, and they had all kinds of festivals, and there was a sort of a spirit of there was a spirit of companionship there, that people were marching together and for the greater glory. And they also told them that first of all, also that Germany had been mistreated after the First World War. They had not been treated fairly, and now was a chance for them to get their bearings back again and come back and come back from this mistreatment, from this maltreatment. So there was a certain community, spirit of community, being in the Hitler Youth, and they got beautiful uniforms. Also in Germany in the early 30s, economic conditions were very bad. And Hitler did bring jobs, you know, he did have many job corps and people built streets and people built highways and housing for poor people. So they did, that was a good thing that they did. And that gave people employment, and therefore they were grateful to Hitler that he had helped them become more, you know, affluent citizens rather than being unemployed.
Yeah.
Because things were quite bad in the 20s in Germany.
Yeah.
There was also terrible inflation. My mother tells me the inflation was so bad, they had suitcases full of money and all you could buy was one bread with it. Money just bought nothing at all, and the inflation changed during the Hitler days. So in that case, in that sense, you can't really excuse the German people, but you can understand a little bit that Hitler made their lives better. And then once they were in it, then they just kept going.
Hitler was prejudiced to Jews all
his life. Yes.
Like, even though his grandma was a Jew, he
I
still
know.
hated him.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
On the streets, you know, during the Hitler days, it was pretty terrible. There was something called the Kristallnacht that you may have heard about, in which the Nazis went from house to house and slashed and smashed the windows and arrested anybody on the street. And there was a number of elderly religious Jews that had long beards, and they would particularly grab them and yank their beards out and brutalize them and beat them. And that was just a sport, and they thought that was a sport for them. But the Kristallnacht was one of the worst things, and they also burned synagogues, they burned libraries, they burned books. They were absolutely brutal.
Yeah, I know. They were totally brutal. They beat any person that really didn't like them at all. Like, they would put them in concentration camps too. Anyone opposing the Nazis would automatically get put in that concentration
Well, my
camp.
cousin didn't oppose the Nazis. He was a 13-year-old boy when they took him and put him in a camp. He wasn't particularly politically oriented, but they simply felt this was a boy who could work. You know, his family they killed because there was an older father and an older mother and small children, so they were shot right in front of him. But he was kept in the concentration camp through his for some 7 years, and he was a worker. He was one of the slave workers who worked in factories and, you know, got very little to eat, and he was not the only one. But he had, you know, it was not as though we didn't like the Nazis. The Nazis didn't like us. Just as in school, for example, when I went, you know, when I finished public school, I was supposed to go on to a secondary school for academic training, which was a mixed school, you know, from the state. And they said that, well, we don't want you because you're Jewish, and we just feel that, you know, you are contributing, you are detrimental to our system of education, and we don't want you here. So we simply had to leave. I didn't have anything against the school. I would have liked to go there, but they wouldn't let me.
Yeah, they were forced to give up, and it's sad because there's this one little boy who saved up all his money and bought a tool set, and then they just took it like right after he bought it.
Yeah.
He saved up all his money to buy it, and then a German SS officer or Gestapo officer decided that he would like it for his son's birthday.
That's right.
And took it.
They took whatever they felt they had the right. They felt that the Jews, also I think Jews and Gypsies and other people and people with disabilities were second-class citizens.
Yeah.
And therefore they had the right to, the Nazis had the right to take whatever they wanted. And,
Even though, and you couldn't sue them because they would say they wouldn't let him have lawyers or anything like that too.
No, my father's business was taken away, and you know, he was not given any money for it, and they simply just because, you know, he was Jewish, and they said that Jews had no right to have businesses. He also owned a house, and they took the house away and said that he had no right to own a house.
Mhm.
So even grown-ups, not just young children,
Yeah.
but grown-ups were really quite helpless.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's just, you can't do that.
Well, you can, what is it?
Yeah.
Might makes right. If no, and you see, the rest of the world didn't really stop them.
Yeah.
It wasn't until later that Roosevelt decided, to go to war and stop the Nazis. But at first, there was really not much that anyone, no one protested really. And there was sort of a silent. There wasn't agreement to it, but sort of a silently ignoring the evils that were being done, and that was what was so terrible about this.
Yeah.
These things were happening, and people knew. There were reports sent to America, under sort of underground reports saying that these awful things were happening, that people were murdered and people were put in not only in concentration camps but also burnt, in these ovens, and people just didn't believe it.
And also, some of the Allied leaders wouldn't bomb like trains
Yeah.
because they said that they couldn't waste the bombs, even though they had enough bombs to still bomb what they also needed to. But they could have just dropped one bomb on one world away, and it would have stopped
A
a lot of
trains,
killing
a number of trains,
and a lot of people dying.
yeah.
I mean, they still could have died. They might have still shot them, but it could have helped.
It would have helped, yes, but it wasn't
Yeah,
done.
it just wasn't done.
Yeah.
Said they couldn't spare flying time or
Yeah.
troops or airplanes too.
And even the churches, I think, even the
Yeah.
Pope, no one really spoke up
Yeah.
for the Jews. They were pretty much on their own.
Yeah.
So let's hope this will never happen
Yeah.
again, and that you will live in better times.
Yeah. Yeah. Here we are interviewing Mr. Loeb, who's in a concentration camp and is gonna tell us his story too. So, I'm Mr. Loeb. I'm Erwin.
Hi, Anna. How are you?
Good.
Good to see you.
So, how did you survive the Holocaust?
How did I survive it?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. I really don't have an answer to that. One, of course, of the things is that I have kept a low profile during all those years. I had learned a trade, and I'm just guessing that because of that, I got sent from one project to another, and it kind of kept me alive. However, I had no control over it, one way or another.
Yeah. How did you get caught then?
How did I get caught?
Yeah.
Well, they just told us to be ready to go and take whatever you can carry, and they put us on a bus and brought us to an area where they collected all the Jews from that particular part of Germany, put us on a train and sent us to Theresienstadt.
Wow. So, what concentration camp were you at?
I beg your pardon?
What concentration
Well,
camp?
it started out in 1938. I went to a Jewish school in Nauheim in Germany, and on Kristallnacht, you know what that is?
Yeah.
They burned all the books, tried to burn the school, that didn't work. And they sent all the boys, and I was then 13 years old, to Buchenwald. And the camp commander wouldn't accept kids. So they sent us back home again. And then the next time around, in 1942, they collected the whole family, including myself, and sent us to Theresienstadt. It's in Czechoslovakia, and it's known as Terezin today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at least you got to be at home more before then.
Well, what are you trying to say?
Like, you got shit back home, so you didn't
That
have
is correct.
definitely
That is correct.
be.
In 1938, they took all the Jewish men and sent them to various concentration camps.
Yeah.
And apparently I wasn't old enough. My dad was there, my uncles and what have you, and they came back later eventually.
Yeah. So, do you remember what it was like in a concentration camp?
Do I remember what it was like? Of course I do. Ask the question and I will answer. What would you like to know?
So, how was the treatment in the concentration camps?
Let me first say that Theresienstadt was originally a fort built for the Austrian Empire. And it had 3,600 inhabitants. There were no longer any soldiers there in those days. And the Germans moved them out. By the way, it's located close to Prague. They moved all the people out, 3,600 of them, and decided that the European Jews are going to be sent there as a transfer point to the various extermination camps.
Yeah, I've read books that say that life was not good there, you know.
That is true.
Like they starved you.
When you consider that in this place where there were originally 3,600 people, at times there were up to 70,000, depending on how many came and how many went.
Yeah. So if they captured more, there would be more, and you'd be more cramped, and there'd be less food. And if there wasn't as many people getting captured at that time, then you wouldn't. It would be better, but
You're absolutely right. However, the conditions wouldn't improve.
yeah.
It was strictly a matter of more people, but the overall conditions remained the same.
Yeah. So yeah, it's not very good. Like to be cramped like that, people aren't meant to live in those conditions with barely any food, with tiny blankets, sharing a bed with 2 or 3 people.
That is correct. Looks like you know a lot about this. You already know more than I want to tell you.
Yeah. So, like, do you know how much food they averagely gave you? I know it wasn't a lot, but
I cannot really recall. In general, you got a quarter of a bread, but the bread was about this size. Okay, it was a German. The bread that, for the size at least, was what they made for the German army. A day's supply for each soldier. We got 1/4 of that. Meat, I don't remember ever seeing. Sugar, once in a while, was very intermittent. There's no rhyme and reason to it. If they decided to give you some, fine. If not, that's fine too. Most of it was soup and coffee, not the kind of coffee you know. This was coffee made from rye, roasted rye and sawdust. Nevertheless, it was something to drink. The camp itself, of course, had its own kitchens and bakeries left over from the day when it was built for the military, for the Austrian military at the time. But they could only cook as much as they were given.
yeah. So there was no.
And of course, during the war, food was at short supply for everybody.
Yeah. They had to have ration cards, even if you were just a regular citizen.
Yeah, well, we did. There was no such thing as ration cards, of course. By luck, you got something to eat for one day, and maybe not the next day. And it also had to do with whether they wanted you to work or not. In my case, I did reasonably well because they caught on real quick that I had learned a trade, and I was a machinist. Never finished it because Jews could never serve an apprenticeship in Germany. So through a Jewish organization, you may have heard of it, Ort, you may have heard of it, I learned to trade. And they caught on real quick to the few of us who had learned to trade, and they used our experience extensively.
Yeah. So what was your life like before the Holocaust? So was your family wealthy?
Well, I was born in 1925. So by the time I was 5 or 6 years old, the Nazis were already, had been very active. but didn't run the country until 1938. Life was pretty good until then. And then practically overnight, when Hitler became the Reich's chancellor, he just took over and then came all the decrees. You can't have jewelry, you can't have a radio, you can't have a car, you can't have a bicycle. The next item was they moved all the Jews into into housing projects. I remember that our house was a one-family home, and suddenly we ended up with 3 families, Jewish families. So things became a kind of crowded. You could not shop any old time you wanted to. You got 1 hour once a week.
Yeah, that's not a lot of time
You got that right.
to go out and.
And well, it was a lot of time because there was not much there to buy in the first place.
Yeah, but still, it's still not a lot of time to.
But until about 1935 or 36, things were pretty good. It was then that Jewish children could no longer go to school. Schools are different, or were different in Germany. The schools were either Catholic or Protestant. They're not public schools like here, or they were not at that time. So most of the Jewish kids went to Catholic schools. And then one of the Nazis' decrees was Jews can no longer go to schools, any school. Doesn't matter whether it's university or whatever it may be.
Elementary
So
school.
then, of course, things changed, you know.
Yeah. Slowly got worse and.
Well, you know, the first thing that I noticed and that I can remember, suddenly you no longer had any friends.
Yeah.
Except for the few Jewish kids. I come from a small town. There were very few children there. And so you no longer had any friends, any non-Jewish friends.
Yeah, and it seems like not your friends like, are a huge part of your life, and
That is correct.
they make you happy, and
Right.
they make you have feelings, and they're just a huge part of your younger life and your older life too.
Right.
So once you don't have friends, it's kind of hard to get along. I mean, you can. It's just harder to without people to depend on.
Well, this of course was the case. That's exactly what they had in mind. They wanted to isolate the Jews from the rest of the population. And in later years they did this in all the other countries they conquered, you know. They did it in France, they did it in Belgium, Holland, Denmark, you name it.
Yeah, all the places that they invaded and got to, they or had allies in.
And most of these Jewish families, most of them, ended up in Theresienstadt to, as I said, it was considered just a transfer point, to be shipped to the various other camps in Poland.
Yeah.
That's a well-known fact.
Yeah.
Even though there seem to be some people who say it never happened.
Yeah, I mean, how can you like leave it? I mean, there's some people that don't even know what it means. I know quite a few.
Well, that's true, but nonetheless, it's part of history.
Yeah.
And it's part of history that has repeated itself.
Yeah. Because you can't let something like this just go by and, older people pass away who've been in it pass away so that no one will even think about it anymore.
It's one thing to read about it. It's
Yeah.
another thing to talk about
Yeah.
it with somebody who has been there.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else that you remember that you?
No, there's nothing I like to remember. But there are some things I do remember.
Yeah.
Life in these camps was pretty much the same everywhere.
Yeah.
Theresienstadt was an exception in that respect, that one day they decided to paint the whole town, make everything look wonderful, put clothes which they had taken from us into what used to be stores, invited the Swiss and Swedish Red Cross to see how wonderful the Jews lived.
Oh yeah.
Then they made a movie.
Oh yeah.
It was called, I have to translate it,
Oh.
Hitler Gave the Jews a City.
Yeah, I read a book
The
about
movie
that.
was made by a fellow by the name of Kurt Gallen, Geerron, and he was already well known in Germany. And then he had immigrated to Holland, and then of course the Nazis took him from Holland to Theresienstadt, made him make this film whether he liked it or not, and then sent him off to Auschwitz after.
Yeah, and then they had Jewish cast and Jewish crew members, and then after the movie was shown, they killed everybody who
That
was
is-
in it.
That's pretty much the case. However, I do know of an exception. I had a friend who's no longer alive who got involved in this movie. Didn't want to get involved, and he was forced into it. And but he survived it. But you never know. You couldn't figure out these people what they had in mind, what they were going to do next.
Yeah, I heard that the Germans even created fake money to
That
make
is
it look like
correct.
they had an
And I do have some of it.
Wow,
I still do have some of it.
that's
I-
very
I gave most of it to the Russell Museum in Berkeley, and but I still have a few of them.
wow. Yeah, they made it look like everything was good.
Right.
and
They
then-
opened a bank,
Yeah.
and it's quite interesting, the notes they printed, very much like our notes are today with Moses on it, and the Ten Commandments.
Wow.
And it says the Bank of Teresa, all in German, of course, because originally this was part of Czechoslovakia. Now let me go back. Originally it was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And then it became Czechoslovakia after the First World War, and the Czechs they wouldn't speak German, period. But when the Germans came, of course, everything changed, and so everything else was in German.
Yeah, and I remember they made people like the camp member would say that they're having sardines for dinner, and then
My goodness, where did you hear that one?
I read a book about it. I mean,
That's a fact.
they would say
That is a fact.
sardines. No, not sardines anymore.
You're right, I'll translate it for you in German. The camp commander was the name of Rahm, R-A-H-M at that time. And I happened to be in Theresienstadt at that time. I wasn't there all the time. And they gave these kids chocolate and sardines. And the kids told them, "Ach, Onkel Ram, schon wieder Ölsardinen. Again sardines." That which translated really meant, we get sardines every day. I never seen one, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So it's very odd how these things come
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, they had to call the camp leaders uncle,
Yeah.
so they would look like they were being nice. And the thing is, if you even talked about it like the way it really was,
Right.
they would kill you afterwards.
Well, you didn't really get a chance to do that because there was no connection between the Jewish population in the camp and the commissions that came from the Red Cross.
Yeah.
I don't see where there were any connections. Just about that time, they shipped me out someplace else. So I don't remember how this all ended, this movie business. But I do know that in February 1945, shortly before the war ended, they sent me back again to Theresienstadt because it was now at a point they didn't know what to do with us.
Yeah.
And everything was just back to the way it was originally.
Yeah.
Nothing had changed.
The Russians and the British and the Americans were kind of closing in, and they didn't want to have the Jews being captured by them, or freed by
but
them.
I was then in a camp near Berlin called Wulkow, W-U-L-L-K-O-W, building some kind of facility for the German government, forced into it obviously, shipped us from Theresienstadt by train over there, and it was an underground facility, and at the time, we guessed that they was going to store all their papers and what have you there. It was a complete city with water, wells, electricity, all built by Jews. So they picked out all the experts, the electricians, and the people who knew how to drill wells, and people who knew how to build barracks and concrete and what have you, and shipped them there. And when the Russians came near Berlin, we ended up between the two lines, the Russian and the Germans. Wasn't exactly fun. As it ended up, the Germans took over again, put us back on the train, not knowing where to send us, of course, and I didn't know. We were on this train for 9 days, with no food and very little water, and ended up in Theresienstadt.
Wow, I mean,
Well, because I think the reason was they just didn't know what to do with us.
yeah, I mean, because, like I said, they were kind of closing in.
Yeah, but there's the other thought, is they did not, I'll have to rephrase that. I think their thought was, we may need these people. Okay, so we're going to save them. Because let's not forget, this was, even though it was towards the end of the war was still on.
Yeah.
And most of the Germans, of course, were all in the army. There were no carpenters, no whatever left to do any kind of work. So our feeling at the time was that they shipped us back and might need us again. And sure enough, that's what happened, by the way. About 2 months into 1945, February, March, about March, mid-March, they tried to ship us out again. And they did ship out a group. I didn't have to go with them. And, but they were never heard from again, so that's all I can tell you about that.
Yeah. A lot of people are so lucky that they almost got sent out to Auschwitz or something like that, but they just quite weren't there. If they were in hiding, they like left their house just maybe a couple of minutes before the Germans found out and barged in. So, I mean, it's really lucky to avoid those things like that.
You could call it luck,
Yeah.
because it didn't make any difference who you were or what you were or what you know. In the long run, if they didn't like you, that was the end of it.
Yeah.
So, I don't know what to tell you. The people survived in Auschwitz. No one knows why. For some reason or another, there were some people, they just, they let them survive.
Otto Frank was one of them. And Frank's
Otto Frank?
Yeah.
Yeah, not his daughter, though.
Yeah.
So you never know. And of course, they had these camps all over. If you ever see a list of where all these camps were located, there weren't one or two. There were 30, 40 of them all over Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them, not all of them, in Poland. A lot of them in Germany, where they used the Jews to make ammunition and war material.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much what I got involved in. We went back, by the way, my wife was there also. So that's where we met, just towards the end of the war, just before the Russians came in, either before or just after. You know, it's hard to pin the date down. One day they were there, the next day the Germans were back there again, and the next day the Russians were back again. But and I think this might interest you, the Americans were there first. It's not very well known that Americans took over. They didn't take over Theresienstadt, but they were there first, and this was during the time after the Yalta conference, when these three big men decided who is going to get what. And it was then decided that the Russians would take Berlin and take over the eastern part of Germany. what I'm getting at is one day a number of jeeps showed up with Americans. And I got to talk to one of them, who happened to be from Germany. He was looking for his mother-in-law, and his mother-in-law came from my hometown. He had married one of her daughters. They had 3 kids. They had emigrated to America. The parents stayed here and ended up in Theresienstadt. And right there and then, they took the mother-in-law with them, and later on, when I dug into it, I found out they put her on a military plane, and somehow she ended up in New York with her children.
Wow. That's.
And it so happens my wife happens to know her too, because if I remember right, they slept in the same room.
Wow. It's.
Her name was Cohn. What else?
Yeah.
I knew the children because those were, I knew her too for that matter. I used to play with the children. The son was very young, was a little guy when I was about 13, 14 perhaps. And then suddenly they found a way to send their children without the parents to the United States. So it is kind of a story that doesn't happen very often, that people are reunited under those circumstances.
Yeah. So, how did you get to America after the war?
For us, the war ended in May 8th, 1945, when the Russians took over the camp. That was the end of it. But then the whole camp got quarantined because of typhoid. So you couldn't get out. And it wasn't until mid-July 1945 that I could go where I wanted to go, but I had no place to go.
Yeah.
By the way, my mother was also in Theresienstadt. She survived it. My dad did not. We decided to go home where we came from. And not knowing what to do, I just went to work, did what I had to, finished my machinist apprenticeship, and tried to get over here. We had relatives over here. But it was not until 1949 that I came over here, because where I lived was in the British occupation zone, and the British would not let anybody out, Jews or otherwise, for fear that there were Nazis trying to get out of Germany. So it took 5 years, nearly 5 years to get out.
Wow. So you're just kind of stuck in there.
And then I came over here, and I've been here ever since.
Yeah. So, well, here's some pictures of my grandfather. He was,
Okay.
he was a weatherman in with the American Army. And here's some pictures of him. When some of them are when he was in training.
Oh, those are old pictures, aren't they?
Yeah, there.
He was born,
Tell me a little
years.
bit about your grandfather.
Yeah. Well, he fought in World War II
Mhm.
on the D-Day invasion. He helped predict the weather. He passed away a couple of years ago, and so now he worked a lot on that, and he helped also drop supplies
Mm-hmm.
to the soldiers fighting on the ground from the air. And he picked up the wounded and brought them back to military hospitals. He's that one there. And so he really so he was, and yeah, he fought in World War II, and
In Europe?
yeah, in Europe and Japan. Yeah.
Very nice.
he was in the occupation too in Germany after the war as well.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
You know, it's odd. I have a cousin who immigrated from Germany in the 1930s with his parents, lived in New York, and about 1946, yeah, 1946, he showed up in front of my door in uniform.
Wow.
So they sent him to Germany. Well, they picked the right guy, of course, in his case.
Yeah.
Well, and I had never met him. I didn't know him at all. Because now he lives in Florida, so we talk to each other once in a while. Perhaps I need to tell you that after many years, 50 years, we went back to Theresienstadt and we did what you're doing right now. We made a video of it. Looks very much the same it did 50 years ago. The numbers on the buildings that the Germans put on to identify the streets are still on the houses. The people have moved in. Whether these are the people who lived there originally or not, I don't know. So it was quite an interesting trip. This is the menorah I made about 1940 in a Jewish metal shop trying to learn a trade in Hamburg, Germany.
And it survived the war?
It survived because of one of my good neighbors who took it into the house and kept it for me until after the war. Then I brought it over here to the States and had it recalled.
Mr. Lowe made that menorah up there in 1940. Is it like in your passage?
I came over on a troop transport from Bremerhaven, and the General Harry Taylor. That was a pretty good trip. In those days it took 10 days to get to New York. Not like you can fly in 6 hours now. I really can't complain about the trip, but I got bored the first day, so I asked the ship's crew. It was a military ship, but a civilian crew. I asked them to give me something to do. Okay. They gave me a paintbrush and I got to paint. And in turn I could eat with the crew. I like to tell this story. One morning, breakfast, one of the crew members sneezed and I said, Gesundheit. Of course I couldn't speak a word of English. And they called the crew together and says, listen to this guy, he speaks English.
That's funny.
That's the story of coming over. And I ended up in New York. I had relatives in New York, so I stayed 2 weeks in New York. Didn't like it. And I went to Chicago, where my now wife lived at the time. Stayed there for a week. I liked it even less. And I came to San Francisco, where I had an uncle, my mother's brother, and I guess between the two of them they had decided that's where we're going to end up. And so I've been here ever since.
That's
I've
nice.
gone back a number of times to Germany. The first time everyone looked like a Nazi. The second time I got accustomed to it. And we walked in this little town where I came from. This little guy on the street whom I recognized as the plumber. And I asked him, I says, Mr. Bergman, do you know who I am? He said, no, in German. He says, I'm Adolf Loeb's son. Oh my God, he says, I had nothing to do with it. That's the first thing. There were no longer any Nazis. So that's one of the stories. And then I made my living the way everybody else does. Started washing dishes. Couldn't find a job because all the GIs were coming home. You know, they got
Right.
their jobs first. But eventually I ended up in a machine shop. And ultimately I ended up at General Electric as a turbine engineer. So that's how my life went.
That's very nice.
Got any good questions?
So thank you so much for.
Yeah, you're welcome now.
When Hitler came to power, he changed the fairy tales, like Sleeping Beauty. He changed it so that he himself was the person who kissed Sleeping Beauty to break the spell. And other fairy tales, like Cinderella, where he was the handsome prince who married Cinderella. Hitler changed from killing Jews with shooting to gassing because gassing was more efficient. They could do it with more people at a time. It cost less, and when people had to shoot the Jews, it was so emotionally distressing to the people who did have to do it. Hitler claimed the Jews had a plot to take over the world. That is one of his reasons that he killed some Jews. In 1944, there was a Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was when two main groups of Jews gathered weapons and bombs and decided to fight the Germans. When the Germans entered the ghetto to take all the Jews out to concentration camps, they were ready and shot them at them with their rifles and threw grenades and bombs. One German soldier shouted to his friends when he saw a lady shooting her revolver. He shouted, "Hans, a woman is shooting." After a couple of days, the Jews were overtaken, but many escaped after they knew that no hope was left. The Americans in World War II weren't as good as we like to think, because during the Holocaust, they did not bomb train tracks leading to Auschwitz, which is one of the main killing centers, and they barely let any Jews in to escape so that they would escape the Holocaust. You could obtain a permit, however, but they made it very hard for you. I would like to say that the Holocaust is a very, very bad atrocity. It has scarred the world forever. We must make sure that something like this never happens again. Because if it does, a lot of people of one race will be murdered by genocide. I would like to say a special thanks to Kathy Jacobs, Judith Barral, Warner Loeb, Peter Heyman, Judy Heyman, Celia Newsenbaum, Elaine Unger, Evelyn Newsenbaum, Fred Vogelstein, and Pat Hall.